Isabel Allende é uma das vozes mais expressivas da literatura latino-americana. Com mais de 10 milhões de livros vendidos no mundo inteiro, Isabel recentemente teve seu romance A Casa dos Espíritos transformado em filme com Meryl Streep no papel de Clara, personagem que Isabel criou inspirado em sua própria avó. Sempre movida por extraordinária curiosidade, Isabel fala de sua vida tão rica quanto seus livros. E para a nossa conversa, ela abriu seu esconderijo em Sausalito, um lugar, como ela mesma diz, sagrado, onde ela escreve e convive com seus espíritos. Com vocês, Isabel Allende, na sua Casa dos Espíritos. Isabel Allende, your own life has so many chapters. So let's start from the beginning. You grew up in your grandparents' house.
Yes, because my parents were diplomats, and I was born in Lima, in Peru. But my parents didn't get along. It was a disastrous marriage from the very beginning. So eventually they separated, and my mother returned to Chile. There's no divorce in Chile still. And at the time, 50 years ago, it was just terrible because she couldn't work. She was not prepared to work. And the society was very close at the time. So she returned to her father's house, and I was brought up by my grandparents, mainly, at least when I was very young. Much later, when I was around 10, my mother married another diplomat, and we started traveling from one country to another.
And your grandparents inspired you to write The House of Spirits.
Yeah, The House of the Spirits is a sort of family story, but it is fiction. I took as models my grandparents and my uncles and several relatives, but I turned them around and exaggerated them so much that I'm sure they wouldn't be able to recognize themselves.
Yeah, but I mean, Esteban Trueba was inspired
by my grandfather.
By your grandfather.
But my grandfather was a much better person. I'm sure that he was not a rapist and he wasn't a killer.
Yeah, you put some fiction on.
When the movie started, I didn't know what to expect because I had no idea of what was going on in the set or anywhere. And then I saw the movie, and at first it was the shock of seeing this humble story enlarged 10,000 times to the silver screen with this incredible cast and this stereophonic music and the sound, the beauty of the color and everything. And then I surrendered to the charm.
Did you feel proud of yourself?
Yeah, at the beginning when I saw my name, I thought, this is it. I don't need to do anything else in my life. However, when the movie started rolling, I realized that it wasn't my story. I don't have any feeling of possession for the movie or the story in particular. I feel that this is the creation of Billy August and other people, and they have done something wonderful.
And you said that your childhood was very lonely. What was it like?
I think that being lonely is a writer's curse. You would not become a writer if you didn't have that profound feeling of separation, that in a way you are different, you don't fit in. I was brought up in a household, a male household, where the powerful people were the males, and the women were very strong among themselves. They had this sort of sisterhood to help each other, but they had no real power. I was always a very rebellious child, the only daughter. I have brothers, but no sisters. And my mother and I were really the only females in the house. And I felt that my mother was a victim of the situation, of the society, of the culture. She had no economic power either, because my grandfather was wealthy, but my mother had nothing. And she couldn't even work. So I had always this feeling that I had to grow up and be productive and be strong to protect my mother. I didn't want to be like her. I wanted to be like my grandfather, so that I would make things easy for her. In the house where I was brought up, my grandmother was a very strange woman. She was clairvoyant, and she spent her life experimenting with telepathy and trying to invoke spirits and moved a 3-legged table without touching it. She was a wonderful character for a book and a wonderful grandmother too. But she died when I was very young.
And inspired Clara.
She inspired Clara. So in a way, I invented this grandmother, and after her death, my grandfather was so angry at the fact that she had died that he painted the furniture black. He eliminated flowers, desserts, music, parties, and the house became a house of mourning. So my childhood was also marked by death at a very, very early stage. My grandfather was angry at the world, so I saw him as a very patriarchal, authoritarian male figure, but he was also the most important male figure in my childhood. So I related to him very much. Salvador Allende was my father's cousin, but he was very close to us because when my father disappeared from our lives, he also left his job in the Foreign Office. He left his friends, his family. He completely withdrew. Many people thought that he had died or that he had left the country. But he was still living in the same city, walking in the same streets. But he descended in the social scale. And Chile is such a rigid class system that when you step out of your class, you disappear. And that is what happened with my father. Salvador Allende remained close to my mother, and he was the only person from my father's family that had a relationship with us.
What kind of relationship?
We had an extended family that was mainly my mother's family, but we would go to picnics with the Allende branch of the family. He would be present in the important occasions, marriages and weddings and all that. And then when my mother married my stepfather was a very close friend of Salvador Allende, so the relationship became closer because they were very, very good friends. When Allende was president, he appointed my stepfather as ambassador in Argentina. So at that time we saw each other much more.
And the day Salvador Allende died, you said this day divided your life.
Yes, not only mine. I think that the lives of most Chileans were cut in half. And many people, most Chileans I would say, divide their lives before and after the military coup. Chile was probably the most solid and longest democracy in the continent. We were very proud of our democracy, and we thought that a military coup was something that would happen in faraway countries, but never in our own land. And when it did happen, it was the most brutal that you could imagine. So I got in touch at that point, the very first day, I got in touch with a dimension of reality that I had not been aware of before. Violence, cruelty. It was something that was always there. They were torturing people in torture centers all over the country 24 hours after the military coup. There were concentration camps all over the country in a week. That was always there. It was not product of an instant. It was always there, and we failed to see it. So from that day on, I think that I lost my innocence. I have never been able to see the world in the same terms, or write or be the same person I was before. And I was against the dictatorship from the very beginning. Half my family was destroyed. Most of them had to leave and go to exile. Some were in prison, some died, some committed suicide. Allende's family was a small family. There are not many Allendes in Chile. We were very easily identified. And at the time I was a well-known journalist, so my name was also on TV and in the newspapers. I had also produced written some theater plays. So also in the world of culture, let's say, I had also a name. It was hard, but it wasn't harder for me than for many other people. I was just one of the many people who suffered from this situation, one of the very many victims of the coup. And I took a position immediately against it, without knowing the risks, because we had never lived in terror in Chile. We didn't know how it operated. I did it at the beginning with a great sense of adventure, as I do most things in my life, without measuring the risks, because I'm fascinated with the story, with each person's story. So I would hear of someone who was in trouble because he was persecuted, let's say, and I would get involved and try to save him. in some ways, or try to smuggle information out of the country and do things that at the time I thought I did for humanitarian reasons only, and so I could not be touched. I was not involved in politics. But that was political, and that was very risky. Mm-hmm. And there was a point when I realized that it was not I who was taking the risk. I was involving my family. My kids could be tortured in front of me. And that kind of thing was happening in Chile at the time. And after a while, I just couldn't take it. The risk was too much.
How was the day you left Chile? Do you remember this day?
Yes, I do remember. It was in July, in winter in Chile. And a series of events had triggered my escape, let's say. And I left alone because I thought that it would be for a very short while and I would be able to return. So my husband remained with the kids. And I left with a passport. Very frightened, I went to the airport early in the morning. It was raining, and I took a plane. I left alone. And I remember the fear that I would be stopped in the airport and would not be able to leave. So when finally the plane left the ground, I felt this sense of relief that I was finally safe. And immediately as the plane starts elevating, it crosses the Cordillera, the Andes. And it's an impressive sight for anybody who has gone to Chile. This is the first image when you enter the country and the last one when you leave. And it's impressive because it represents something that is greater than the country. It's something that has to do with God. It has to do with history. It's everything represented by those huge mountains. And I remember that it was a cloudy day, a gray day with a gray sky. Even the snow looked gray on the mountains. And I was alone and crying and very frightened. Many, many years later, I returned for the first time in love with a new husband on a beautiful summer morning. And there was a crowd waiting for me in the airport. And I thought, this is like a metaphor of my life. My life goes like this always. There's always a very dark
period.
A dark aspect. It can be a period or a side of life. And there's also a very shiny, brilliant moment that is like in opposition to that darkness. It's light and shadow always. It's love and violence, death and life. And my life seems to go back and forth between these two powerful images. Yes, so I see the image of summer and winter, of leaving and coming back as a metaphor of my life.
When you left Chile, you start writing. You said that you hadn't time or you hadn't the way to say goodbye to your grandfather, and you start writing a letter.
My grandfather had a stroke when he was nearly 80, and I was living in Chile at the time. He had a stroke and everybody thought he was going to die. And before that, he had made me promise that I would help him die. And I promised because I was very young and I didn't know what I was promising. And then he had the stroke. And he was not conscious enough to ask me to help him die. And when he was conscious, he did not ask. But when we were living in Venezuela many years later, we received a phone call in Venezuela saying that my grandfather was dying. And I knew that I had promised that I would go back and help him die. And I didn't. I did not go back because I couldn't. So my way of saying goodbye to him was writing this sort of spiritual letter that later became The House of the Spirits.
The book.
The book.
How was your experience in exile?
Very hard at the beginning. Not because I chose the wrong country at all. Venezuela at that time was one of the very few democracies in the continent, a very open society that was living the oil boom. So it was rich, outrageous, spontaneous, happy. You were describing Brazil as a place to party. Venezuela was a place to party in 1975, but I was not prepared for that. I came with a lot of pain, separation, losses, with a lot of sorrow in my heart, and very poor, with no visa, no money, and no friends, and not a family either. So my situation was that I could not adapt. I couldn't see the good aspects of the society. It took me years to accept the Venezuelan character and love it. Many, many years. I couldn't find a job as a journalist, so I did all sorts of odd jobs to make a living, and I was humiliated many times. It was a very humbling experience, and I'm a very proud person, so it was hard. I learned a lot. I think I became a better person, though. And all my books come maybe from that feeling of failure, from that feeling of marginality, that you don't belong, that you have to create a world of your own to exist.
Because you are an outsider?
You are an outsider, you're a foreigner, you're separated. I have talked this with my husband, because he has the same feeling, and he says it has nothing to do with exile. It has to do with childhood. It has nothing to do with the fact that my father abandoned me. It has to do with something that some people are born with, a feeling that you don't fit in, that you don't belong. Maybe that's why you end up writing. Really, it hasn't much to do with literature. The writer writes, and there's a lot of people that make a living analyzing or criticizing what we writers do, and that's their job, their realm, and their work. Most normal human beings don't read the critics, so it doesn't affect you really. How do you sell books? Not because you have a good review, but because people recommend the book to each other. My books are not, they are also bestsellers sometimes, but what is characteristic of my books is that they are long sellers. The House of the Spirits was published 13 years ago, and we are now publishing I think we are in this 37th edition. So it's still being published. And it can have the most awful reviews by the hardest of critics, and people still recommend it, and people still buy it. So I have a connection with my readers that allows me to not care very much about the critics.
You have 10 million copies sold. You are in your fifth book. You said, if I was a man, nobody would be comparing me to anyone. Can you explain it?
Well, when The House of the Spirits was published, it was compared extensively with 100 Years of Solitude by Garcia Marquez, and I felt very flattered and very proud because I admire him enormously. I think he's the best Latin American writer of all times, and one of the most important writers in the world. So I thought, if I was a dancer, I would love to be compared with Nureyev. If I'm a writer, be compared with Garcia Marquez is fantastic. However, after 5 books, and I will publish my 6th book now, and after writing books that are so different from each other, I don't accept the comparison anymore. First, because I don't think it's fair anymore, and second, because I want to be recognized as having some originality of my own. And when a woman writes or a woman does anything, the critics and even the public wants to see the influence of some male model. And I understand that for my first book, but I'm not going to accept it now.
What moves you to write?
A deep emotion that has been with me for a very long time, and usually that emotion is painful. It is something inside me that I have to explore. I write fiction, I write stories, and I think that I don't make up the stories, that I pick them up from the newspapers, hear what people have to say. I'm a good listener. And I always think that the stories just fall on my lap. But thousands of stories fall on my lap. Why do I choose that story? And it has to be only that story and no other. Only those characters and no others. Because there is something inside myself that I have to explore through that story. I have to go in a journey with those characters through the story in order to find some light inside myself about something that is very painful. My recent book, it will be published very soon, is a memoir. I would have never thought of writing a memoir before. I always thought that memoirs were boring. But my daughter died recently. And for a year she was in coma. And I had to stop everything. My life stopped completely. And I sat at her bedside holding her hand for a year. And during that time, I had, for the first time, the privilege to be able to revise my life and see what my life is about, see the pattern, see the design, see why and how I do things. And I went very deep into some place of extreme pain where I found the force to write this book. And I thought I was writing this book because at the beginning I thought I was writing it for my daughter. And then when I finished the book and I read it, I realized that I was writing it to survive. Without that book, I would have killed myself, I think. I thought about it many times. I thought that I could not take that kind of pain and that separation. But now that I have finished the book, I know that there is no separation. And that somehow there is a very strong spiritual force that I was not aware of before. And this is a new stage in my life, an important stage.
Isabel, in your books, as in your life, life and death, as you said, are very present. And for you to think about this so deeply, the way you do, makes you have more acceptance
for death?
For death.
Yes. Everything dies. Nothing lives without death, and death would not exist without life. They are two sides of the same coin. It's as if it's the same fabric, the same thing. But you have to reach the threshold of death to feel it inside, to understand it profoundly. And I have the feeling that that night that my daughter died, I went with her to the very threshold. And I really tried to cross it and couldn't. And I'm here still. But I had a glimpse of death through her experience. And it's not a frightening thing. It's something that I look forward to. It's not that I'm suicidal or depressed at all. It's this wonderful curiosity for this other aspect of life that death is. Mm-hmm. This other life that I feel so strongly that is really there. And it's here between you and I. It's part of our nature. It's part of this world that we cling to, and we think that this is reality, and it's just an aspect of reality. There is so much more that is more profound and deep and interesting, so many other dimensions of the spirit and the soul that we have to explore. And in a very instinctive way, I had been doing that with my writing without even knowing what I was doing. I just wrote because I liked the story. And now I know why I wrote that. Now I know that I was exploring something that I could never find without this extreme pain. So the gift of my daughter has been to open my eyes, my third eye, to this golden reality that I was not aware of. I said before that when the day of the military coup, I seemed to wake up to this dimension of brutality and violence. That day that my daughter died in my arms, I woke up to the knowledge of total, absolute love, which is the contrast, the opposite to the extreme fear that I experienced before. Mm. It is an opening to something that is beyond fear, beyond every other human emotion. It's love in its pure essence. And that is what it is about. Unfortunately, you can only experience it in flashes. It's not a state, an ecstatic condition that some saints achieve. It's flashes that some people have when they are drugged or in orgasm. They feel for a fraction of a second that that's it, and then they are disconnected again. That night, during all that long night of my daughter's death, I experienced that altered state of consciousness that gives you a glimpse of what is there, really.
And when you say that you thought many times about to kill yourself, was to follow this track of light?
Yes.
Was this the meaning of killing yourself?
It was a sort of impatience of the heart, a desire to follow the journey of the soul. You know, something very strange happened that year. That year, when Paula was sick in coma, I brought her home and I organized a hospital in the family room. In that same family room, my granddaughter was born. And both moments, the moment of Paula's death and of Andrea's birth, were made of the same fabric. The clocks were still, time stopped. There was a sacred space in that room for the coming to the world and when Paula left. When Andrea was born, I received her in my hands and I cut the umbilical cord. And I asked the baby, tell me, where did you come from before you forget? And then I realized I was being silly. But the idea was that she came with all this world behind and she was going to forget. And then Paula left to follow the journey of her soul. Just as I brought her into life, I brought her to death. And both moments were so similar, and I wanted to follow her because I wanted to go on with my journey. I had the feeling that I have done enough in this world, that it's okay. I've already lived 50 years. What more? I don't need to live anymore. Now I want my soul to explore other things. I want to follow that.
What is behind?
Light.
I want to see beyond.
Yeah, it's curiosity, a sense of adventure. I'm not depressed. It's adventure. I create a character, and then I fall in love with a man who resembles the character. And I think that the man is the character. And really, I'm in love with the character, not with the man. And my curse and my fate is that I will discover it sooner or later. And I will discover the real human being that I have adorned with all the trimmings of the character. So that's what I fear about the power of the writing, that it becomes so powerful that you think that is reality. And you hold it as if it was real.
And do you miss it when you lose it? When it doesn't, you don't have to work on it anymore?
When they are gone? You mean when I finish a book? No, I have a feeling of relief because you never finish a book. You just give up. You are tired and you want to get rid of it, but you can always change things. Yes. So a book is a never-ending project. So by the time I give up, I just want to leave those characters, and I really want to get away from the story.
Do you feel the presence of spirits around you?
Yes, constantly. This is not something that I feel now. I have always felt it in my life, because I was brought up with this wonderful grandmother who was summoning the spirits, and they were living in the house. They were a real presence in her life and in the house. And when she died, she said that people don't die, that they only die when you forget them. But as long as you remember them, they will live with you. My daughter repeated the same thing in a letter that she left before she died. Before she fell in coma, she wrote a letter, and the letter says exactly the same thing. And I believed when I was a child that the spirit of my grandmother was in the house and she was protecting me. And I have lived with this belief all my life. And then my grandfather died, and I have added him to the protective spirits that I have. So every time I need strength, I need discipline, I need to be tough and aggressive and smart, my grandfather comes to help. Mm-hmm. When I need to be imaginative and intuitive, my grandmother comes. When I need irony and softness and gracefulness, my daughter comes. And all these spirits are here with me all the time. You see the photographs all over here. Every day when I come to my office to work, I light a candle for the spirits, for my grandmother, for my mother-in-law who died, and she was a wonderful human being, for my grandfather, for the spirits of the desaparecidos in Chile that have inspired me and accompanied me, for the spirits of so many others, and mainly for my daughter's spirit. So I'm surrounded, held by all these forces.
You keep yourself in the house of the spirits.
Yes,
And you've never been afraid of death?
Yes, I have been afraid of death. I was afraid of death when my children were little. When I thought that if I wasn't around, they would perish. When I was the life force for them, I was terrified of death.
And feeling the presence of the spirits, because the problem with death is the loss, is something almost for yourself, you know, because for them maybe they are much better, we don't know, but the loss, how do you deal with the loss? How do you learn to deal?
I suppose that people do it in different ways. I don't deal with the loss. I surrender to the loss. It's like water, and I just jump into it and let myself float on the loss, on the pain. I don't resist it. I don't fight it. I don't try to deny it. I don't try to deal with it. I just surrender. And you know, when you surrender to the pain, it comes through and goes away. It doesn't go, the pain doesn't go away. The stress goes away, the anxiety, the fear. And then you just surrender to this thing that is very similar to love and very similar to extreme pleasure. Because it's also a sense of abandonment, of merging. You are not separated. You just surrender. I have a life here, and it's a happy life. I have an American husband, and my son lives here with my grandchildren, and I don't want to be separated from them, if possible.
Infinite Plan is your first book talking about America.
Yeah.
And how do you feel as a foreigner talking about an American society?
I feel that I had a lot of help, because this book would have not been written without my husband's help. This is his story, the story of his life. This is the world seen through his eyes. I very much acted like a reporter. I interviewed him for 4 years. In the meantime, we had some sex too. But
it's a good research, a good way to do research.
Yes. But he took me to the places where the story happened, to all the places except Vietnam. I did not go to Vietnam. And through his eyes and his voice, I could tell the story. So for me as a writer, it was a wonderful experience, a very liberating experience, because I was not writing from the point of view of a woman. I was not writing about great female characters. I was writing from a screwed-up male character, a white American male, in a country that was totally alien to me, in a time where many things happened and I was not present. Because California in the last 50 years has been a wonderful place for change. Think of the 50s, the American dream of the 50s, all the things that happened in the 60s, the cultural revolution of the 60s, the drugs, the hippies, then the Vietnam War, the sexual revolution, the crazy 80s. And this time of renovation that starts in the 90s. All this period I was not here. I was a foreigner, a faraway witness through the press only. And I could get into it with my husband or through him. That was a fantastic experience.
What is your aim? What is something that keeps you going on?
I think that for many years, what kept me going was the loves I had. These people, this bunch of people that I loved so much more than I loved myself. These people I wanted to protect. And because I loved those people so much, my family so much, I wanted a better world for them. So I fell in love with causes because I wanted to change the world so that the world would be perfect for them to live in. And now there is something different. I don't want to change the world. I think the world is changing, fortunately. And I don't want to overprotect my family because they will die. We will all die. And there's nothing I can do to save them from pain. Now the goal is enlightenment. It's a very pretentious goal, but the goal is to find the light. And it is a spiritual journey that I have to do alone. And each one of us has to do alone. And for the first time, I feel comfortable in this sort of loneliness. in this feeling of having to do it by myself. No one can help me or go with me.
Isabel, thank you very, very much for this interview, for your words, for your soul, and for all the spirits in your house.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Very unusual questions.
Thank you.